Okay, class, as promised, I decided that I would do another recording to permit you to listen to lecture notes offline and assist you in understanding concepts that are relevant to topic 3. And as you know, topic 3 is the following: Eurocentrism, and black struggles with Western models. So what I'll do is I'll walk through these lecture notes as efficiently as I can, but in hopes of giving you some understanding that you can apply to your critique papers, to your class forum, as well as to your afterthoughts and conceivably to your praxis papers. Cite these lecture notes as you would any other lecture notes. I'm just simply narrating them so you can use them for discussion later on. And I'll give you the link to the Du Bois film that we began to watch in class with Dr. Tolson, but of course I had my technical difficulties and we couldn't finish. These pictures will become more apparent as I go through the lecture. I'm going to explain this statue and the significance of this statue of Booker T. Washington. This is a picture of the young Dr. Du Bois, and in many ways capture this period of roughly 1895 to 1915 that we're studying. And then there's a book by Lawrence Otis Graham entitled Our Kind of People, where he studied sort of the inside of Black America's upper class. But this goes along with the idea of Du Bois's talented 10th. More to come on this. By the way, I do have music playing in the background just so it sounds a little more like a documentary. I know you say whatever. Okay, so remember from class last time that I said we're going to think very centrally about what constitutes this concept of Eurocentrism, of placing Europe or Anglo-American European values and perspectives and understandings of the world at the center of our analysis, sort of in contradiction to or in opposition to Afrocentrism that places Africa and African culture at the center of cultural and political analysis. Well, I just want to highlight that particular quote that I borrowed from Rudyard Kipling, a well-known short story writer and author in the British literature. Known for writing The Jungle Book and Rikki Tikki Tavi and other children's stories that are still captured by Disney today. But this poem comes from one of his epic poems that serves to make him what Orson Welles would call a prophet of British imperialism. And we read this in class, but I'll stress this again. The poem begins: "Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child." Oh my. And again, this is from Rudyard Kipling, The White Man's Burden, the United States and the Philippine Islands, 1899. Now, in case you're thinking that, well, that was 1899, that was clearly a white supremacist view of the world that saw this Eurocentric notion of sort of of Britain and the United States and other Anglo-American or Anglo nations having to carry the burden of the quote-unquote colored peoples of the world. That was back then. What relevance does it have to now? Well, there is a particular recent political figure that I want you to guess on. I want you to guess which political figure on the extreme right in today's American politics recently applauded Kipling's prophecy of Jewish domination of American society, because Kipling was not only racist but anti-Semitic. That individual is David Duke, the same David Duke that Donald Trump has struggled at times to repudiate. So just keep this in mind relative to the current dynamics of race. Okay, a few more quotes. And this quote is quite relevant because it is the quote from Du Bois that frames this entire section. It begins, "In the folds of this European civilization, I was born and shall die, in prison, conditioned, depressed, exalted, and inspired. Integrally a part of it, and yet much more significant, one of its rejected parts." Now, I just told you that quote comes from Du Bois. But would you guess that's the young Du Bois or the more mature Du Bois? Is it from Du Bois of 1903 or 1940? Well, it comes from The Dusk of Dawn, 1940. And that's relevant because Du Bois lived such a long life that he wrote more than one autobiography. And in this autobiography, he becomes quite reflective. It's at a point of Du Bois's life where he has clearly turned from some of the elements of his earlier thinking and began to kind of repudiate some of his earlier thinking, including the Eurocentrism of his own thinking. Now, I give you the possible responses of Booker T. Washington or W. Du Bois with this next quote. Who do you think said this? "We believe that the first and the greatest step toward the settlement of the present fiction between the races, commonly called the Negro problem, lies in the correction of the immorality, crime, and laziness among the Negroes themselves, which still remains as a heritage from slavery." Is it from Washington or from Du Bois? Well, if you guess Du Bois, you're correct. Now, why Du Bois? This is simply to show you that Washington and Du Bois were not that far apart in their thinking at the turn of the century when Booker T. Washington was becoming most prominent. Only when Booker T. Washington and a group of black intellectuals that Du Bois would clearly identify as the talented 10th began to pull wider apart, began to conflict with Booker T. Washington as a power broker, as well as what they saw as a racial accommodationist. They then influenced Du Bois's thinking, and Du Bois became more radical in his own thinking relative to Booker T. Washington, particularly when he thought that Washington was trying to undermine him politically as well as in terms of his intellectual pursuits. Now, there's a famous statue that sits on the campus of Tuskegee University. Tuskegee University is that institute, or it was first, it's now university. It was initially institute when it was first founded by Booker T. Washington. And this statue has this benevolent framing of Booker T. Washington as this father figure who is leading the enslaved out of darkness. You have this enslaved man where Booker T. Washington is pulling the folds of ignorance from his eyes. The man sits on an anvil and is holding a book that would light the knowledge that this great educator would provide to the quote-unquote Negro people. Well, there's this quote that has always stuck in my mind where a famous author, a famous African-American author, wrote this quote, wrote this phrase, or put this particular section in a story he was telling, that what didn't directly reference Booker T. Washington, but indirectly referenced Booker T. Washington, and the character he described reminds you of Booker T. Washington. The quote goes, "Then in my mind's eye, I see the bronze statue of the college founder, the cold father symbol, his hands outstretched in the breathtaking gesture of lifting a veil that flutters in hard metallic folds above the face of a kneeling slave. And I'm standing puzzled, unable to decide whether the veil is really being lifted or lowered more firmly in place. Whether I am witnessing a revelation or a more efficient blinding," unquote. And in case you guess, can guess who wrote that, it was a brilliant writer, Ralph Ellison, Invisible Man, 1952. And Ralph Ellison is noteworthy in many respects, but because Ralph Ellison became extraordinarily famous in the 1950s, but he wrote one book and did not have the ability to finish one more book. In fact, the book that he finished was lost. I think it was burned in a fire or stolen in a car, the manuscript was. And so Ralph Ellison, while he was alive, only wrote one great book, but that great book still shapes American letters. Okay, so let's talk about in this lecture, and this is simply me going over ground that we covered in class, but of course not with these graphics and this wonderful music of Scott Joplin in the background. But let's talk about the age of imperialism and industry. Let's discuss the social context of the post-Reconstruction North and South that would frame the thinking and the lives of Booker T. Washington and of W.E.B. Du Bois. And then, in our class discussion, we'll get into the warring ideals. Remember, the warring ideals is a phrase I borrowed from W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folks, his section on double consciousness, of the two poles of these warring ideals that form that double consciousness. So Washington's vocational versus Du Bois's liberal arts education. Here's a picture of Cecil Rhodes, a British imperialist and extraordinarily wealthy man at one point, who colonized parts of Africa, particularly southern Africa, or parts of southern Africa, and that nation, so much to the point that a nation was named after him, Rhodesia. Rhodesia would later on become an independent nation in and of itself. Then here's sort of this notion of Uncle Sam taking that same posture, stretching his feet across the seas and taking an imperial posture. But this was the period, again, to typify this notion of the post-Reconstruction South, where African Americans, due to a host of ways in which the reforms of Reconstruction were dashed into pieces, were returned to the land, not that much above slavery. Slavery by another name, as said by Douglas Blackman. And thus what prompted the Niagara movement, the 1905 Niagara movement that preceded the NAACP and became a kernel that eventually, not directly, but eventually would become the NAACP when founded in 1909. Okay, so here's a chart that illustrates a point we made earlier in class. Remember earlier in class I said that I asked you which states of the former 11 Confederate states, which state had the most African Americans elected to public office during the Reconstruction period? And many of you rightly guessed South Carolina. South Carolina in 1870 had an African American population of 415,000, which constituted 58.9% of the population of the state. African Americans were a predominant majority of the state of South Carolina as a vestige of slavery and the populations that were brought into the state of enslaved Africans. This meant that when these African Americans were given the right to vote, and many whites were stripped of the right to vote until they declared loyalty after the Civil War. They fought in the Confederacy until they declared loyalty to the Union due to the 14th Amendment and the provisions of the 14th Amendment. These African Americans were the predominant majority in electing people to office. So you had some 314 African Americans elected to public office in this period. In fact, this is more black folk elected to public office in South Carolina in 1870 roughly, or 1873, than was elected to public office in South Carolina in 1963. So history doesn't always march forward. And that's why I say in this Reconstruction period was a period of political and economic turmoil and reform, and lasted roughly between 1867 and 1877. But when it ended, and white man's government resumed, some 1 million African American voters were disenfranchised. Okay, so let's talk about the age of imperialism in industry. Here's a picture of Queen Victoria, among the longest reigning monarchs in the British Empire. And Queen Victoria is known for many things, and she became such an important and popular figure in British and Western civilization that the entire era was named after her. The Victorian era, an era where there were certain presumptions about how to shape the home, how women had a certain place in the home, and there were certain values of morale, of thrift, of the work ethic, certain very conservative values that she embraced and the age embraced along with her. Then this is a picture of a sort of or an illustration of scientific racism of the African Americans being seen as the missing link between the orangutan and Europeans. Here is sort of a picture of the great robber barons of the period, or this is an era where, particularly in American history, prior to the progressive movement, there were vast disparities in inequalities in wealth. Sound familiar? And the ways in which these robber barons had a certain economic motive in talking about a certain gospel of wealth, that wealth and greed are good, something that we would say again in the 1980s. Then this idea of the European or the white man's burden of showing the native people's technology that would uplift them out of their inferior state. Here's a picture of Queen Liliuokalani, the last reigning monarch of the Hawaiian kingdom, who was forced to abdicate her throne, as I said earlier in lecture, and partly supplanted because the white planter interest, the white plantation interest of Hawaii became so dominant that they could overthrow the queen by military force. And of course, those who were backers of the Republic of Hawaii, where some of their last names were Doe. Then here's a picture of Charles Darwin, and we'll talk about Charles Darwin again in his relevance given this particular section. So let's talk about Europe and the racial conquest of this period of 1840 to 1945. As I said, this period of 1880 to about 1945 sort of represents the height of colonial conquest of Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and actually many parts of Asia. As I also previously said, books such as Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa suggest how imperialism, which should be distinguished from the slave trade, represented a new phase of European dominance because of the actual acquisition of land, not just of taking people away from Africa, but the acquisition of land, as well as the exploitation of labor and resources, and the settlement of the African continent, among other continents, by colonial governments. Rodney, as a neo-Marxist, was influenced by Lenin's idea of imperialism, the highest Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, where Lenin postulated that a once competitive capitalism was replaced by a monopoly capitalism, where larger and larger monopoly industry and interests drove the foreign policies of nation states. We'll get more into that when we discuss elements of capitalism and of imperialism as viewed through a Marxist lens. Okay, now remember I referenced this notion of the Berlin Conference of 1888 and 1884. And the Berlin Conference of 1888-1884, it was a conference that happened in Berlin, Germany. It occurred where the major European powers, including France, England, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal, met to decide upon current political boundaries of the African continent, literally carved up the African continent among themselves. Again, you remember I discussed sort of Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, and so it gave a sort of ideological justification for this carving up. It's very similar to the notion of the Monroe Doctrine or the Manifest Destiny Doctrine in the United States that said the Monroe Doctrine that the United States could dominate the Western Hemisphere and had the right to dominate the Western Hemisphere, or Manifest Destiny that said the United States had the right to be a continental empire from sea to shining sea, knocking out, of course, and defeating Native American nations in order to claim such territory. So there is, as I talked about, an American imperialism, a Manifest Destiny American imperialism that is part of this European broader project of imperialism. As I said, white supremacy and notions of white supremacy were at the heart of American expansionism. This led to the colonization or military interventions in the following nations or territories that we've discussed, and this runs from roughly 1850 to 1900. The nations that were part of this American expansionism included Cuba, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Nicaragua, Panama, China, Uruguay, and the Portuguese West Africa, or Angola. In many ways, this was seen as notions of progress or civilization. And that was the American rationales were very in step with Rudyard Kipling's thinking. Because remember, Kipling wrote this poem to justify American expansionism in the Philippines. So let's talk about science and scientific racism that also was part of this age of imperialism and industry. This notion of progress and of civilization, but progress and civilization through a very Eurocentric lens. So I talked about the notion of the polygeny theory. Earlier on, I made mention of the work of Stephen Jay Gould, G-O-U-L-D, Stephen P-H-E and Jay Gould. In this book, The Mismeasure of Man, he talks about how this imperial drive toward progress was paralleled by an objective, scientific justification for racial dominance. In fact, that's what scientific racism is. It's sort of the incorrect or fallacious use of science to justify racial dominance. And we know that it's sort of a long progression within European thought which attempted to demonstrate how science could be used to prove the inferiority of African people. You know, we know of Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, which we'll visit later on. And there is also sort of this interesting quote that has always struck me from Alexander Humboldt, Humboldt. And he says, who was a contemporary of David Hume and a contemporary of Thomas Jefferson. He says, whilst we maintain the unity of human species, we at the same time repelled the depressing assumption of superior and inferior races of man. There are nations simply more susceptible to cultivation than others, but not in themselves nobler than others. Now it's interesting, even given that Humboldt and Thomas Jefferson were in relatively the same era, because Humboldt makes a argument that in fact there is this notion of superiority is problematic, but that was not the dominant voice of the day. And thus we have sort of, as I said, Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, in 1859. And he has this theory of natural selection. And natural selection is this idea that there are successive mutations over generations of a species that improves, quote unquote, upon that species, or a better or more scientific way of saying, makes that species more adaptable over time, in the course of its longevity. It adapts to its environment in order to survive. Well, polygeny, among other theories, were a theory that would argue, in many respects, that there were multiple human origins. There were multiple places of human origins. Not all human beings derive from a common ancestry upon the African plains, but that these species were born or derived from different places. So it helped to justify how Africans, such as the South African Hottentots, could be compared to apes like orangutans or chimpanzees by suggesting separate lines of human evolutionary development. And the introduction of quack sciences such as craniology. Craniology was the measuring of the brain in the brain cavity to justify that, well, clearly some individuals are smarter than others, some races are smarter than others are more intelligent than others because they have larger brain capacity, larger brain cavities. Well, again, social Darwinism, even though Darwin would be somewhat resistant in the toward making this comparison and using his work for this purpose, it was used for this purpose. There rose a brand of thinking propagated by those who saw themselves as white Anglo-Saxon males. Social Darwinism asserted that human cultures who were on the top of the racial and economic ladder of the Western world were endowed with a biological and cultural superiority. They were more rationally intelligent, more level-headed, they had a stronger work ethic, they restrained their emotions, and they had Christian morality. And all of these things helped them to excel. In fact, this argument was used to rank not only Africans and Europeans, but was even used to rank races, quote unquote, of Europeans. So let's talk about, in this broad framework, industry and the gospel of wealth. And I do this because, again, this is framing as to when and the context in which Du Bois and Booker T. Washington would have their great debate. Booker T. Washington was clearly influenced by thinkings around wealth accumulation of the day, of the work ethic, again, Queen Victoria, of the morality and work ethic of the day. And so let's unpack it a little. First of all, there is this notion of the gospel of wealth. And you've taken American history courses, so you're probably familiar with these terms. Again, in this period of the turn of the century from the 1800s into the 1900s, this was a period of great urbanization, industrialization, and immigration, particularly within the U.S. And efficiency and production were the twin catchwords of this age to encourage sort of a passive conformity to a stark wealth structure. In other words, the gospel of wealth simply argued that if in fact you were wealthy, it was because of your superior ability. You were wealthy because you had the work ethic and the ability to accumulate wealth. If greed was good, it justified greed was the ends that justify, or the means that justify the ends of enormous inequality. So capitalists such as J.P. Morgan, Franklin D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Carnegie were sort of argued to be these great captains of industry because they were brilliant men. They had the capacity, the work ethic, and sort of the racial capacity, almost, if you will, to become wealthy. Remember, this was the period, very similar in some respects to today's period, where 5% of the wealthiest Americans at this period owned 60% of the nation's wealth. And so, billionaires like J.P. Morgan were sort of the richest individuals in the world. In fact, J.P. Morgan was so rich that his wealth exceeded the value of the Federal Gold Reserve in Fort Knox. So this idea of social mobility and social wealth said that, well, if you simply picked yourself up by your own bootstraps, you would do well. You just got to work hard and you can become like me, just like me. So let's talk about this Victorian age and the Victorian morality of this age. It was an age that, along with this notion of the Protestant work ethic, the idea that if one simply works hard, one will succeed. Those who don't succeed because they are lazy, they are slothful, they are immoral. So it had sort of these very conservative values around sexuality, around the patriarchal structure of the family, that men were the dominant breadwinners and rulers of their households, that women had a very specific set of places and were not to challenge men. And along with the confinement of women was the sort of passive domain, or women were confined to the passive domain of the home. And if women did not comport to these values, they clearly would have an impact upon the culture of the society and the well-being of the children of the society. And so women had to be virtuous, they had to be faithful to their husbands, and they had to have a certain cleanliness and thrift in observing these values. Okay, so let's talk about the social contract of the post-Reconstruction South. So we're going to think about, we've already seen the film, or sections of the film, of course, on the life of Du Bois, but I want to give you some broader context. Here we have a picture that demonstrates the might of the British Empire as it fought against the Zulu nation and of South Africa, of Shaka Zulu and the Zulu nation, and fought for the right to dominate South Africa. Here is a picture of the first class of African Americans elected to U.S. Congress during the Reconstruction period. This picture comes from the infamous film by D.W. Griffith, Birth of a Nation. And of course, here's a picture of Booker T. Washington and of W.E.B. Du Bois. Okay, so let's talk about Reconstruction and Southern redemption. Now, Reconstruction, of course, was a period or an era that saw enormous change given what emerged after the Civil War. So Abraham Lincoln initiated the program, but he was assassinated before it became full-flown. So he was assassinated in April of 1865. His vice president, Andrew Jackson, took over from him. Jackson was a Southern Democrat. Jackson was a Tennessee man. Some said he was barely illiterate. He was not a very well-educated man. And he was very white supremacist in his thinking. He really kind of loathed or detested African Americans. But he was loyal to the Union. And thus the reason why he became Lincoln's vice president, because he was a Southerner who was loyal to the Union. Well, this period of Reconstruction saw sort of an enormous political and economic gains. So you had the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment established equality before the law, and stated that all persons born in the United States were citizens of the United States. So it automatically granted enslaved African American citizenship, as well as did some things to try and reconcile the Confederate States to the Union. And the 15th Amendment, of course, was the amendment that guaranteed the right to vote regardless of race, creed, color. Then, of course, you had the various Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875 that were sort of helped to lay the groundwork for the amendments, and also established the first sort of civil rights acts that would bar social discrimination, and the Freedmen's Bureau that emerged. In fact, Du Bois wrote a book about this period entitled Black Reconstruction, where he argued that African Americans, even though this was a tumultuous period, it was a period where the African American working class and African American elected officials saw some real gains and pushed a progressive movement and a democratic movement in the United States for multiracial democracy. And then, of course, you had black political empowerment. For a brief period, extraordinary numbers of African Americans were elected either to state, local, or federal office. For instance, as we've said in South Carolina, the state legislature of South Carolina in 1868 had 85 black representatives and 70 white representatives, 10 blacks and 21 whites in the Senate, 75 blacks and 49 whites in the House. Likewise, 4 out of the 5 the congressional representatives in 1872 were black. Among them were Robert Smalls and Robert Elliott. And by 1875 overall, we've said there were enormous gains, 1873, 1875, enormous gains in this period. If you get an opportunity, you can come back and click these links that show you nice overviews of Reconstruction. Then let's talk about black disenfranchisement. So on one side, there was a massive effort after the period of 1877. So in 1877, you had what was called the Tilden-Hayes Compromise, as you all know well from your American history, where the political parties essentially decided that Tilden would concede he won the popular vote as the Democratic, but he would concede to Hayes, the Republican, if the Republicans agreed to pull the troops out of the South and give the South back to white governments, to white supremacist governments. And that's essentially what happened. So you inaugurated a period of great disenfranchisement. On one side, there was a massive effort to strip blacks of political and social rights through disenfranchisement, tactics such as the grandfather clause, poll taxes, literacy tests, the white primary, and gerrymandering. And by the end of the period, you had somewhere around 1 million African Americans who were stripped of the right to vote. And of course, as I said, it's also a period of racial terror. Jim Crow, racial terrorism throughout the whole period. Somewhere between 1880 and 1910, some 3,000 black men, women, and children were lynched. And this doesn't include all of the persons who were lynched. There were Italians, Irish Catholics who were also, or Catholics who were also lynched, because it was, anyone who was not a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. But African Americans overwhelmingly were lynched in this period and terrorized by organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan. So enters Booker T. Washington, who was known as sort of the Wizard of Tuskegee. You've heard of Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz. Well, this was the same period where that book emerged, and Booker T. Washington, given popular culture, was dubbed the Wizard of Tuskegee. And Booker T. Washington, just to give an overview of his life, he was born in 1856 on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. From the time he was famous to the end of his life in 1915, he, like Frederick Douglass before him, became the sort of paramount, the chief, most predominant leader of the African American community. And this was, whether folk liked it or not, Booker T. Washington became a key power broker. Booker T. Washington built Tuskegee Institute, modeled after the place where he received his education, Hampton Institute, which is now Hampton University. To understand Washington, who I contend is a complex figure, it's important to remember that he and his Tuskegee Institute were products of the racial conservatism, the conservative work ethic, and Victorian morality of the age, particularly of Washington's mentor and white father figure, the General Samuel Armstrong. And you can learn more about General Armstrong and his educational theory for African Americans, which would impact the thinking of Booker T. Washington, from the book by Professor James Anderson. And I can give you that site. Now, Anderson calls it the sort of Hampton-Tuskegee model. In founding Hampton as a teacher's college in 1868, which taught a strict pedagogy of vocational training and manual labor, Armstrong was concerned about sort of quelling all chances of black labor conflict and the perceived ghost of the Reconstruction. Armstrong was a critic of Reconstruction and Negro dominance in the South, highly critical, and kind of paternalistic in his thinking toward African Americans. Not kind of, he was very paternalistic in his thinking. Thus, his mission was to create a new class of black teachers committed to teaching African Americans their logical, submissive place in the renewed racial and economic order of the New South. So Armstrong was about teaching the black people their proper place. As a matter of fact, he, like many Southern reformers, deplored the notion of liberally educated black person. Folks who are learning philosophy and learning, abstract science and mathematics and literature. That was of no use. He pressed, and he was also critical of anyone pressing for civil rights or social equality. So you can see where this father figure would have a predominant thinking upon Booker T. Washington. He felt the newly emancipated black race was more morally than intellectually deficient. Thus, he calculated or inculcated in his graduates these sort of Victorian notions of self-reliance, hard work, and thrift, more so than the outlines of sort of classical liberal education. As Armstrong reasoned, quote, "The American white race has had 3 centuries of experience in organizing the forces about him: political, social, and physical. The Negro has had 3 centuries of experience in general demoralization, and behind that, paganism. So his sort of greatest students were Booker T. Washington and Robert Moton, M-O-T-O, who was Washington's, who would follow after Washington's predecessor, who, like Armstrong, believed in cultivating mission in regards to the Negro and built the maintained Tuskegee Institute around his ethic in 1881. So it's clear that Washington sort of takes on a certain level of racial conservatism. And I argue that Washington and his particular brand of self-help had its roots in conservative philosophy or belief that government should not intervene in the economy, in the market. Generally, the competition within a free market is the best guarantee for group and individual progress. And Washington embraced the ideology of the age about this new industry, this new entrepreneurship. The economic right was more important than the political right. And these were the keys to his thinking with regards to black progress. In this way, Washington was sort of an interpreter for white folks. He became sort of an interracial diplomat, and thus why he was called the Wizard of Tuskegee. He became sort of a masterful interracial diplomat and characterized the spirit of his age by succumbing to the tenets of racial docility, racial accommodation, and entrepreneurial capitalism, thus appeasing the philanthropic North, the great philanthropist of J.P. Morgan or Carnegie, who would give Washington millions of dollars for his Tuskegee Institute. So he appeased these philanthropists of the North and reconciled them to the Jim Crow South. Washington became world-renowned and received honorary degrees from Harvard and other institutions, along with being granted audiences with Queen Victoria of England, among other European heads of states. And it was his white philanthropy that fueled Washington's Tuskegee Institute. In fact, Andrew Carnegie at one point gave Washington his first gift. And keep in mind, this is the late 1800s into the early 1900s. He gave him a gift of $600,000. $600,000. And he gave Washington, and that was for the Institute. Later on, he would receive some $150,000 that could be personally used by Washington as he wants, and those of his family during the life of him or his widow. So Washington and all of his family were well taken care of. Later, there would be sort of a money trust, and a trust is sort of a group or a cabal of individuals who are wealthy, who have the ability to exert influence through their wealth. So the individuals who would give to Washington included John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, George Eastman of Eastman Kodak, Robin Ogden of the Southern Education Board and General Education Board. And at some point by 1950, Tuskegee had an endowment of an unheard of endowment of $2 million. Just to put it in perspective, $2 million was the amount that the Freedmen Bureau Bank had invested from African American enslaved persons. So Washington had more money at one point than all the savings of all enslaved African Americans had invested in the Freedmen's Bureau Bank, just to keep it all in perspective. Washington was also clearly a power broker. He had what was called sort of the Tuskegee machine, and a machine in this era is an organization that has political dominance, a party organization that has political dominance, the political machines of New York or Philadelphia or Chicago. Washington not only exerted extraordinary political influence either by sort of strong-arming a leadership prior to the NAACP, but he was also clearly dominant in various other organizations or over organizations. Washington was a founder of the Negro Business League, and Tuskegee became his center of power, his center to sort of amass this power. For nearly 15 years, any significant sum that a philanthropist considered donating to a black institution other than Tuskegee was first cleared by Washington. Washington was the, excuse the use of the term, head Negro in charge. And it was very likely that Du Bois and Atlanta University suffered as a direct result of Washington's tactic, and then increasingly his spirited disapproval of the institution's support for Du Bois and his views. Du Bois fell out with Washington because Washington became too iron-fisted and too dominant in having to clear everything that occurred in Black America. And not only economically, politically as well. Washington was a political boss. Washington was the most important political figure within Black America between 1915 and 1910, and had a virtual monopoly over the Black influence wielded in the administration of President Theodore Roosevelt and William Henry Taft. He particularly served as a gatekeeper function, determining who would and would not receive political appointments, based upon whether they were loyal to Washington or whether they eventually joined the camp of his detractors, including Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter. Washington was responsible for or was consulted on important appointments. James Clarkson, as the surveyor of customs of New York, had to go through Washington. Isaiah T. Montgomery, as the federal receiver of public monies in Mississippi, had to go through Washington. Robert Terrell, who was the husband of Mary Church Terrell, and we'll talk about Mary Church Terrell, and was the District of Columbia's first Black assistant superintendent of schools and first Black judge. It had to go through Washington. John C. Dancy is the district recorder of deeds, through Washington. Charles W. Anderson is the chief clerk in New York State Treasury and the supervisor of accounts, Washington, and on and on. And Washington took out his, punished his enemies as well as helped his friends. He, in fact, had control and dominance over several African-American political newspapers, and would determine the copy of those newspapers. And so that's why individuals like William Monroe Trotter, and particularly Ida B. Wells, got incensed with Washington. At one point, Robert Church Terrell was informed that his wife, Mary Church Terrell, had to be quiet. In fact, the term was used, a muzzle, as in like a dog muzzle, had to be put over that woman. So that these were the political battles that occurred that incensed this new talented 10th, and Du Bois among them. And so Du Bois emerged very reluctantly as the spokesperson of the talented 10th. Now, as we've said before, and I want to be careful, I don't want to be too grand in my praise, but W.E.B. Du Bois is probably the most influential African-American scholar of the 20th century. He's among probably the most important 50 to 100 scholars in American thinking, period, in terms of his global influence. As a scholar, he was the author of no less than 21 books and book-length manuscripts, 3 autobiographical works. Du Bois lived 95 years, so he wrote 3 autobiographies, several books of fiction and theatrical productions, over 2,000 articles, was the founder and editor of the Crisis magazine. And again, as he lived to be 95 years old, he was actively involved in nearly every important political and social movement that Black Americans had in this period between roughly 1868 to 1963, including, of course, the founding of the NAACP, the early Pan-African conferences. He was a leader in the International Peace or Nuclear Anti-Proliferation Movement, Labor and Radical Rights Movement, World and Socialist Communist Movement. Du Bois took it all in. As I said, Du Bois died the day before the historic March on Washington in 1963, buried in Ghana, West Africa, at a state funeral given by the president of the independent nation of Ghana, of West Africa, Kwame Nkrumah. But Du Bois was also a product of his age. And so in many respects, Du Bois stated, this notion we said that he was in the folds of European civilization, and he became quite aware of this. And in many respects, as we'll unpack Du Bois's thinking, he clearly also struggled with his age. I'm not going to go into the same amount of length a discussion with Du Bois as I did with Booker T. Washington, because we've already watch the film on Du Bois, but I want to give you just a little bit of a flavor. So, just to think about it, what were some of the similarities and differences between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington? So, some of the similarities between Washington and Du Bois were, one, both kind of embraced these notions of higher civilization. You know, they believed that the mission of the elite was to educate the lower masses. Two, they were also kind of partial to what they saw as the reasonable limits of suffrage. Du Bois thought there should be some degree of intelligence testing at first, believe it or not, with regards to the vote. He didn't want the vote just to go to the uneducated rabble. Booker T. Washington didn't want the vote to go, Booker T. Washington didn't press the vote. But it's also to keep in mind, even though Washington had these strong-armed elements about him, he also has this history we discovered that secretly Booker T. Washington was funding suffrage cases and funding anti-discrimination cases. So he's a complex figure. On one side, he was making these public pronouncements about pushing away from suffrage and from political agitation. On the other hand, underground, he was funding and supporting those who were pushing against these limits. So he's a complex figure, even though he was a dominant and very powerful figure. A third similarity is they were both believed in the strong Protestant work ethic. And they believed in some notion of being able to lift yourself up from your bootstraps. They believed in some notion of social mobility. They had a belief in the social pathology of the lower classes who were morally underdeveloped due to the vestiges of racism and slavery. And to some degree, they both were patriarchal in their thinking. They believed in Victorian family values. Except Du Bois did struggle and became a little bit more proto-feminist in his thinking as he got older, and thinking about how to be even-handed in developing the education of women. And they also both believed in sort of this progressive march of science and industry when coupled with a concern for human welfare of the working man. Principal differences between them, however. Between Du Bois and Washington, they parted over the idea of the place of the educated elite. Du Bois said the talented tenth and racial uplift is primary. Washington was not really pushing a talented tenth. He was pushing a vocationally trained working class. And Washington acquiesced to Southern hostility against black civil rights much more than made Du Bois comfortable. It's because Washington kind of took it too far in Du Bois's view and was such a dominant power broker that Du Bois slowly but slowly began to part company with him. Just to tell you that when Booker T. Washington first gave his Atlanta Compromise address, where he says, you know, we can be as separate as the hands on the finger, talking about blacks and whites, when it comes to the social realm, but come together as a fist when it comes to economic progress. At first, Du Bois sent him a note saying, that, good sir, was a word fitly put. So this was 1895, but by 1903, a little less than a decade later, Du Bois would be writing a chapter of Mr. Washington, where he directly, but very surgically, took on Washington. And he did not write as strenuous as David Levering Lewis tells us. He didn't write in the language that was quite as strong as William Monroe Trotter or in the language of Ida B. Wells. But he did take on Washington. And that essay became the parting of ways, where they clearly, Washington saw Du Bois was now over in their camp. And was not going to be hired by me and my institute. And the institute, again, just to keep in mind, was this place where Washington vocationally trained generations of blacks to assume positions as mechanics, as housekeepers, as other what he saw as practical endeavors. So this class is where we'll discuss we'll have our debate about the warring ideals between Washington and Du Bois. I don't want to get into all the elements of Washington's life because we've already discussed it, but at the same time, I wanted to give you some context, a little more context to write your essays. Okay, well, thank you for listening to this lecture, and I hope you do well in all your assignments. This is a lecture presented by Dr. Todd Shaw at the University of Michigan, University of South Carolina, at the University of South Carolina, Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies, copyrighted by Todd Shaw. Thank you and have a good day.